Resuming debate, the honourable member for Guelph.
Madam Speaker, we shouldn't even be debating Bill C18 today. Alongside tens of thousands of Western Canadian farmers, members on this side of the House await the plebiscite that this Conservative government is legally required to hold under Section 47(1) of the Canadian Wheat Board Act before it can apply its ideological scalpel to a Canadian institution that has been the backbone of grain farming across the prairies for decades. Nevertheless, if we've learned anything from the behaviour of this government in the early days of this Parliament, its ministers are rolling out the greatest hits of the Reform Party, throwing caution to the wind and stifling debate as much as possible, and taking the rest of Canada along with it, no matter who it negatively impacts. Neither the Prime Minister nor the Minister of Agriculture have ever made much of a secret of their single-minded desire for the death of the single-death system. But what they have kept from inquiring Canadians are the reasons they refuse to hold a plebiscite of the Wheat Board membership. Or even why in March, heading into an election, the minister assured farmers that there was no reason to worry and that their opinions would be sought on the Wheat Board when it came forward in this Parliament. Once it became clear that the minister had no intention of honouring his March pledge, the Canadian Wheat Board held its own plebiscite on the continued operation of a single desk under the Canadian Wheat Board. And the results were clear. Majority of Western Canadian grain farmers chose the stability, competitive advantage and clout, not just in Canada but overseas, that it enjoys due to its numbers brought together under a single desk. In August, 68,000 ballots were mailed out to farmers. Over the course of that month, meetings were held across the prairies, and hundreds of farmers came in off the fields for meetings as harvest began, simply to ensure their voices were heard. Farmers from both sides attended these meetings, and they listened respectfully and made their points as to why they believed it should go or why it should stay. I attended several of these meetings and was astonished, as were the organizers. Never before had they held a single meeting where over 500 farmers attended, such as the one in Saskatoon in early August. I set out to listen to the different viewpoints of various farmers, and at one meeting was pulled aside by one farmer from the Saskatoon area. He said to me, and I will paraphrase because he used much more colourful language, quote, "I haven't voted Liberal in the last 1,000 years, and it's unlikely that I will do in the next 1,000 years. But I certainly did not vote Conservative so that they would or could kill the Canadian Wheat Board," end quote. Now, I may not have changed his vote, Madam Speaker, but what he wanted to ensure was that someone in Ottawa was listening to him. Sadly, he couldn't go to his own MP, because just when farmers are asking them to listen and represent the farmers' best interests, Conservative MPs are nowhere to be seen or heard from. Not one single Conservative Prairie MP has the courage to stand up and defend the rights of their constituents to hold a government-conducted plebiscite as mandated by Section 47(1) of the Act. The Conservative Party only received 24% of eligible Canadian voters, which certainly does not constitute a mandate to run roughshod over the democratic rights of farmers to maintain their livelihoods under the Canadian Wheat Board Act. Desperate to have their votes heard, farmers held their own plebiscite. The results of the plebiscite were unambiguous, with a 56% response rate, a number similar to the turnout in many recent general and by-elections, including the minister's own riding. 62% of wheat and 51% of barley producers voted to retain their single-desk marketing and sales arm under the Canadian Wheat Board. Regrettably, the minister simply dismissed the results as an expensive survey. Unfortunately, Canadians do not have the same opportunity to dismiss their muzzled Prairie MPs' own election results similarly. Many argue that with the fragile state of the world economy, the CWB is more important than ever before for the grain-exporting prairie provinces. The livelihoods of Canadian farmers and small businesses are at stake. Recently, even The Economist wrote that concerned about the death of the single-desk marketing system, and I quote, "Smaller producers faced with mounting marketing costs will inevitably have to sell their farms to bigger rivals or agribusiness companies, devastating small prairie towns whose economies depend on individual farmers with disposable income." Madam Speaker, I've heard from farmers, even some who favor killing the wheat board, that thousands of farms managed by farmers whose age exceed the average age of farmers in Canada, which is 58 years old, are likely to close. With their closure, so too will the small town and village economies supported by those farmers. They will suffer. We risk seeing an end to a number of small towns and rural parts of our prairie provinces. The board markets and sells on behalf of every wheat and grain producer in the prairies to some 70 countries and 100 buyers across the world. Its unique position allows it to act as a price setter instead of a price taker. In contrast to The Economist, the Wall Street Journal welcomed the impending demise of the Canada Wheat Board, noting, quote, "More money goes back to farmers than under an open market system," the open market system that this government is proposing. Madam Speaker, it then went on to say, quote, "Grain handlers such as Cargill Inc., Viterra Inc., and Bunge Limited could see their roles and returns in Canadian grain markets grow." At whose expense, Madam Speaker? No one else other than our prairie wheat farmers. In fact, recently in a report from Alliance Grain Traders International, who are conveniently only now opening a pasta plant in Saskatchewan, they said their, quote, "market erosion is combated by negotiating lower prices from growers." From my time on the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food, I've learned that a major reason why pasta manufacturing has not been meaningfully undertaken in the West is because they are too far distant from a market that would consume its products, and transportation costs would be too great. Now that the Canadian Wheat Board will be abolished, it is the opportunity to get the lowest possible price for grain from farmers that are no longer able to set the best possible price, that will allow pasta manufacturers to offset the transportation costs of marketing their pasta, again at the expense of Western Canadian farmers. What is clear here is that the protection of the family farm in the prairie provinces is not a priority under a Conservative government. They would prefer to create an environment that would see farmers fail than support an environment that protects the ways of life for multitudes of farmers and their families whose way of life will be dramatically changed and not for the better. For whom will they be changed? For the well-being of large agribusiness and foreign interests. Without the Canada Wheat Board, which returns excess profits to the pockets of farmers, the larger rail and grain companies who could sustain their own networks will finally have access to those farmers' profits. Their interest is not the well-being of farmers, but rather their own bottom line. Farmers will be left to bid one another down to the lowest possible price to sell their grain. We know it not only from studies, but intuitively, that farmers will fall prey to the gluttonous appetites for profit of grain companies and the railways, appetites that have been held in check by a steady diet controlled by the Canadian Wheat Board. In the wake of the minister's pronouncements on the death of the CWB a month ago, shares in Viterra dramatically spiked. Moreover, there have been no assurances made by this government regarding Canadian food sovereignty. It is one thing that these small family farms will be bought up by massive agribusiness. It's entirely another to see Canadian farms expropriated by foreign interests, not unlike the purchasing of our mineral-rich lands out west, concerned more with their own national food security and not at all with Canadian food sovereignty. It certainly does not help that just yesterday the United States backward step with Buy America unilaterally thickened the border in an effort to stimulate their own economy. Meanwhile, the Canadian government is prepared to give itself a hernia, removing all of the tools that Canadian wheat and barley producers rely on to protect their livelihoods, including the Canada Wheat Board. The number one trade ask by Americans has always been to get rid of the Wheat Board because it gives our farmers a competitive advantage. And now, with our Prime Minister as the head waiter and bottle washer to the Americans, we are preparing to hand them a huge agribusiness, the very request on a platter with absolutely nothing in return, not even a modest tip from a country who has shrugged their shoulders and wrapped themselves in the shroud of American protectionism. There have been 14 challenges to the World Trade Organization from the United States demanding we get rid of the Canadian Wheat Board. In every instance, the WTO has ruled in our favor and allowed Western grain producers to maintain their valuable resource. Why are there challenges, Madam Speaker? Because the Wheat Board gives our farmers a competitive advantage that is the envy of others around the world. Make no mistake, once it's gone, the provisions of our trade agreement say that it can never be brought back. We would be foolish and naive to think that our supply-managed industries, like chicken, dairy, eggs, and turkey, are not already now being lined up in the sights of this government for their demise. This is not about limiting choice for farmers. The CWB is in a unique position to market different qualities of grain at different times of the year to different markets through a board that knows and serves the diverse needs of many farmers. Its strength is in the fact that all farmers across the prairies are in it together. Its elected directors are farmers too. They understand what it is to sell and market grain, the best grain in the world. Should this legislation pass, by reducing the number of directors from 10 elected and 5 appointed to simply 5 government-appointed directors to the 5-year interim voluntary wheat board, the Conservative government would have it that only their own people, dictated to from the Prime Minister's office, speak to the multitude of farmers. Overwhelmingly, wheat board election after election, directors that support the single desk under the wheat board are returned. Farmers elect these directors, and yet once again, suppressing any sort of democratic expression, this government places a higher value on ideology than the experience of farmers. These are farmers that understand the virtue of saving $1,400 per producer car on transportation costs through the CWB's unique bargaining position, a savings that will be almost immediately lost. Presently, it is in a position to negotiate with CN and CP Rail to ensure the adequate supply of producers' cars. This too will be lost. One of the more substantial complaints from within the agricultural industry is that Canada is regarded as an unreliable supplier of agricultural products by virtue of the fact that it cannot get its supplies to port along the railway. In large part, this is a direct result of the ongoing disputes between suppliers and CNCP Rail. The agricultural industries anticipated that these concerns would be addressed in the rail service review, tabled in March of this year. Meanwhile, 7 months later, we are talking about stripping prairie farmers of transportation infrastructure while this government shelves yet another report. This government has failed to appoint a facilitator in good time. It has failed to address the day-to-day logistical issues of shippers, like getting them the right number of cars and on time, and is telegraphing to the farmers who will be affected by this in large part, farmers who do not have immediate access to the border, farmers who are not on the main line, that where once its concerns were difficult to address with the rail companies, now they will be almost impossible to address. I've learned through my discussion with short-line railway owners that they will no longer be able to maintain their railways, as they will no longer have the support of the Canadian Wheat Board once it's gone. And the rest of farmers still will not have any resolution along the main lines. As it stands, hundreds of grain facilities have access to only one rail line and are held captive by either CP or CN, subject to their charges. Through the Canada Wheat Board, farmers have had the clout to, as a unit, stand up to both CN and CP and get the best deal for their transportation costs possible. In my conversations with Western Canadian grain farmers, all too often I've heard tragic stories about the treatment of producers at the hands of the railways. The railway companies have such disregard for wheat farmers that often they will send railway cars with holes in them without any consideration for what grain will be lost along the way. Farmers individually are up against a behemoth where once their collective clout enabled them recourse in the face of such poor treatment. This government also refuses to acknowledge that there is a value added of $500 million annually in services provided by the Canada Wheat Board in the form of critical weather analysis, research and development, as well as the transportation benefits. Even by using a network of over 800 weather stations located on farms across Western provinces, the Canada Wheat Board provides accurate, up-to-the-date, up-to-the-minute weather information, as well as grain research and innovation. In a token offering in the legislation, the government is recommending a voluntary checkoff to be applied toward grain research and innovation. What farmer will check off additional money for research and innovation while their profits are going up in smoke? Yet this government seems intent on spending money estimated conservatively at almost $500 million in a time where they claim we are still in a fragile economic state, to demobilize an organization that has yet to require any federal funding. It has been farmer-funded for farmer profits, forsaking billions of dollars in revenue with no sound replacement model is reckless. Yet this government made it clear it will only listen to farmers so long as they are saying something the government wants to hear.
Shame.
Canadian farmers know what is in their own best interests, and the government would do well to listen to their collective voice, not simply to the voices of the few who will be in a better position than the many to profit from the demise of the single desk system. For our part, the Liberal Party entirely opposes this reckless, ideological legislation and finds no value in the feckless rhetoric of the minister and members content to vote like lemurs for the demise of a system that is still supported by the majority of its members. I challenge the minister and the party opposite. If they are not afraid of the results of a plebiscite on the continued existence of the single-desk system, if they truly feel that a majority of Western Canadian farmers are on side with their prescription for the death of the Canadian Wheat Board, they should withdraw their legislation and hold their own plebiscite on the issue, as mandated by the very legislation they hope to destroy, the very legislation that Western Canadian farmers hold so sacrosanct, that the necessity for democratic expression is enshrined within it to protect farmers from the very abuse that this Minister of Agriculture is currently perpetrating. Madam Speaker, in closing, I move, seconded by the member for Malpeque, that the debate be now adjourned.